I'd like to now invite our wonderful speakers and panellists to come up on the stage. And as they're walking up, I'm just going to give you a quick introduction to each of them. Now, the panel today is the skills for the future, and it's a bit of a call to action to all of our organisations, companies, governments, other agencies, universities, boards and individuals. And it's about the work skills and the business skills and the business models that are going to apply and be needed in the digital age. So I'd like to introduce the speakers, if you'd just like to come and sit down. And I'll... Sorry, the stairs are over here. We have Holly Benson, who is the practice leader and partner with Infosys. She leads the organisational transformation practice that includes organisational change management, learning and strategic human capital. We have Ashwin Ram. He is an innovation fellow at Palo Alto Research Centre, and that is a spin-off of Xerox. It's a very well-respected research lab that has spun out quite a lot of innovations in information technology. We have Lucy Marcus. She's the founder and the CEO of Marcus Ventures Consulting, and she's also a professor of leadership and governance at Instituto de Empresa in Madrid. She has her own TV show on Reuters and is a specialist on boards and leadership. And our last speaker, Tracy Wilen-Daugenti. In fact, she's going to be our first speaker. She's a thought leader on society, education, work and careers, and she's managing director of the Apollo Research Institute. She's also a visiting scholar at Stanford Media Program and a former executive of Silicon Valley at Apple, HP, Cisco, and she's now at the Apollo Research Institute. And Tracy, you're going to be the first of our panelists to please stand up and tell us what is your big idea for the event this morning. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you and good morning. What I'll do is, yesterday I gave a brief overview of the 8 forces that are impacting the future of work and 10 skills for the future. So let me just recap that so I can level set you, because I saved one key skill for this morning. So I covered how we move from a classical world to a technology-based world. I think that's important as leaders and as employees. Some of the forces that I covered was extreme longevity, the fact that many of you in the room will be living to 100 and your kids to 120, which means you're probably going to work 60 plus years. I talked about the VUCA world, volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous, and how each of us in companies deal with that every single day. Deep diversity, computational world, and the rise of smart machines. On the topic of skills, I covered things such as the need to express yourself using multimedia literacy, cognitive load management, having the ability to sort and prioritize the massive amount of data coming at you. Cross-cultural competency, which means, of course, language and the ability to work across cultures, at the same time doing it virtually, using technology such as video conferencing, telepresence, and WebEx. I talked about the ability of sense-making, how to take data and experience and solve problems, and finally, novel and adaptive thinking, competing with machines rather than competing against them. So what's the big jawbreaker for today? It's transdisciplinarity. The skill in a very complex world. To make it easy to remember, think of the T person, the breadth and depth person covered with, let me add, because I live in Silicon Valley, technology. In a complex world, what corporate leaders are saying is we need these people who can speak the language of multiple disciplines. For example, finance people who can speak and understand marketing, who can also understand sales and operations. Now, for the executives in the room, you have some choices. You can make that person, or you can buy that person. And in fact, I thought it was very timely that a recruiting firm sponsored my session yesterday, because that's the decisions that corporates are making. They want these complex people to be able to start the road running, right? Up and start and be able to accomplish things immediately. So let's assume, because I know there's employees in the room, that you would like to make and build these people rather than buy. Some best practices shared in our thought leadership workshop were think about structuring lateral moves for employees starting off. Don't wait till they're at the top, but start them off when they come in. Give them more exposure. Put people on cross-functional projects. Swap out with startup firms. Bring in innovation and swap back out process. And also create prize projects so teams can come together, as such as you have at AMP, the ability to create new services and revenue. So let me switch now to the employees, because we're living in this innovative world, and this is what we're trying to accomplish. You are not off the hook. This is a partnership. The ad hoc employee is over. It's over. It's time for you to take control of your careers for the next 60 or 70 years. So, what can you do? Raise your hand. But raise your hand for those key, critical, high visibility projects and have dialogue with your management on how you can do that and measure your success and keep metrics on yourself. Learn the culture of and how things get done in the firms where you work. Expand yourself to opportunities and projects outside of your own area. Be that T person who will make that rotation. And finally, partner with your company and with your firm and let them know that you're interested in moving them ahead in innovation in a sincere and tangible way so that you prove results. So that's my big idea for innovation, skills, and the future of work. Thank you.
Okay, would you like to come up and speak, or would you prefer to sit down? Yes, you're next.
It might be safer.
I can come up.
This is some sort of test.
Balancing
Skills
test.
test.
Well, good morning, everyone. So I think the real reason I was picked for this panel was to provide some gender diversity. I have one simple idea to share with you in terms of skills for innovation, which is to embrace risk, to embrace failure. My daughter, who's in high school, goes for this after-school volunteer, run by volunteer session for budding architects and designers. And they go out there and they work on projects, and there's even a national competition. And one of the days that I was driving her home from that, she said, I wish school was like this. And I said, well, what's the difference? You still work, you're doing drawings and looking up the physics of buildings and whatnot. She said, well, in school, I'm afraid to say the wrong thing. Whereas here, I can fail. I can do the wrong thing, and that's fun. And I learned from that. I think we are very afraid of failure. I live in Silicon Valley, and Silicon Valley, I think one of the big eye-openers for me living there has a very deep-rooted culture of failure. If you're a failed entrepreneur, you're more likely to get funded for your next startup, as compared to someone who's never failed before, never tried before. You've learned something. I did my PhD dissertation at Yale on learning by failure. We researched how people learn from failure, and we built computer models of that. It's a very powerful process. So in a company, you have to create white space to allow yourselves to play, like in a sandbox, like a kid would, and do the wrong thing, and build sandcastles that don't work. Your managers have to give you that freedom to do that. If you're always afraid of trying something because you may do the wrong thing, you're not going to innovate. If you watch a kid pick up a new gadget for the first time, a phone, for example, they pick it up and they'll poke every single button on it, trying to figure out what it does. Whereas many of us, we have gadgets, we have phones, we have computer systems. We have no idea what half the functions are because we never bothered to poke at them in case something might go wrong, right? So we have to get off that mindset. So I think my one lesson here, my one message is embrace failure, because that will lead to innovation. Thank you.
It's good to know that a specialist in artificial intelligence also doesn't quite know what all the buttons on his phone are for. Join the club. Holly, would you like to step up? Thank you.
Thank you and good morning. It was very interesting when I was first asked to participate in this conference. Right about at that time, Marissa Mayer at Yahoo was saying, no more work at home. And I thought, this is really, really interesting. And I don't know the woman. I've never worked with the woman, but I kind of wanted to pull her aside and go, Marissa, that train has left the station. What interested me about it was a response to old paradigms. Old paradigms. Business has moved on. The words that we're hearing being used right now are around globalization, virtualization, externalization, multidisciplinary. And while Marissa can pull all the people in Silicon Valley back out of their houses into the office, she can't pull the people in the global network. She can't pull the people in the partnerships and alliances, and if she cuts them out of the equation, her or any other executive, she's missing the boat. So my big idea is really, you have to redesign not just your skills, not just your culture, but your entire human architecture in a way that enables you to excel in the modern world with all these trends that we're talking about. You can't look at skills in isolation from how you aggregate those into jobs and organizational structures and delegations of authority. You can't look at that in isolation from how you set objectives for your employees and manage their performance and reward and compensate them. And you can't look at that in isolation from the overall corporate culture, the unspoken rules of behavior that really drive the choices we make. So what do you do about that? You invest in designing that human architecture. Do the hard work. Spend as much time on that and design it with the same precision and the same engineered set of forethought that you do your data architecture or your information systems architecture or a business process or your physical architecture. It's possible, and it makes the difference between the winners and the also-rans in today's environment. Thank you.
Thanks, Holly. Lucy, would you like to step up? Thank you.
You can't say we're risk averse when we're walking in high heels on a skinny little platform. I think we're very risk taking. Well, thank you for having me this morning. My area is boards and the boardroom. I sit as a board director on a number of companies, and I write about and think about and speak critically about the role. Most of what I write about are sort of letters to myself, reminders to myself about what to do. When we think about the boardroom, you know, the world has changed so much, and I had to give a talk about boards and the changing nature of boards, much like what I'll be doing here. And my son was 5 or 6 at the time, and he said, "Mommy, you know, where are you going?" I was driving him to school, and I said, "I have to go and give a talk about boards." And he said, "It would be much more interesting if you went and gave a talk about birds." and I tried to explain to him what boards were, and you know, he's a little British boy, even though it doesn't sound like it, and so he's big into King Arthur and the Round Table. And I said, you know, for people who look at the boardroom from outside, it looks very much like King Arthur and the Round Table. Wise men, usually men, go into a wooden paneled room and sit around a table, and the door closes with a whoosh. And you have this feeling, right? It's right, isn't it? And you have this feeling that these men are sitting around and thinking big, wise thoughts, and that there's a lot of expertise in the room. And then the door opens, you know, and of course there's King Arthur, and he's the chairman, and you know, sort of keeping everything in order. And then the door opens, and the men stream out and bring that wisdom and greatness, and they're chivalrous and decent and bring greatness onto the world. And in that room, they speak a special thee and thou language. But the truth of the matter, right, is that for those of us who sit in the boardroom, we know that actually we're not always that wise, that our discussions are fairly human, and that King Arthur comes in all kinds of guises, and that the only thing that's really true is we do speak in a special thee and thou language, Mr. Chairman, and and we defer to one another and so on. And when we go out, we do the best we can, but we're human. But actually, to my mind, I quite love that idea of King Arthur and the Round Table, and I think it is what we should be doing. We should be wise in those rooms, and we should have the people around the table with all kinds of skills and ability, and diversity in the case of not just gender diversity, which I believe in very strongly, but also diversity of age and skills and abilities, because the businesses that we are running are changing very quickly. And we need people around the table who can understand that. Because when you sit in the boardroom, you've got an agenda of 20 things, and you've got about 10 or 20 minutes per thing. And most of us, we have some skills and abilities and expertise, but we're not experts in everything. But we must make fast decisions, and we must be able to synthesize data very quickly, calculate what it is, and take a decision that will impact our organizations, and not just our organizations, but we no longer answer just to shareholders. When you say, who are we answerable to as board members? But actually, our world has changed as well in that we answer to an entire ecosystem. Companies hold more power than ever before, and so we are responsible for where we sit in an economic situation, in our economic community, our partnership relationships, our employees, our stakeholders at large. And so those are the people we're accountable to. So when we sit in the boardroom, or when we look at the boardroom, we must realize that actually our aspiration should be that ideal. And we need to work harder at making sure that we hold ourselves to account and that we ask ourselves the really hard and uncomfortable questions. Are we doing what we should be doing? And by the way, if we have people around the table who are not doing that, they should be fired. And that is one of the biggest and difficult things actually for boards. When I go to gatherings of board directors, one of the biggest pain points are deadwood directors. And we need to hold ourselves to account. And if you have someone around the table taking up one of those very precious seats, there aren't so many, and if things have changed, we also need to be able to have the strength and ability to hold them and ourselves to account and apply HR sort of policies to the people around the table and say, thank you very much for your service, it's time for you to go. So thinking about our boards as we think about other things, and I just leave you with one thought, which is if you had an employee who came in your office, played around on Facebook and Twitter, which, by the way, that's important to use, ate somebody else's yogurt from the kitchenette, stole a couple pencils and went home, you would fire them, right? That's pretty normal. If you have a board director who doesn't read their papers, shows up to the meetings, gets flown in, taken by car, goes for the slap-up meal we're often given, and asks a couple of disruptive questions but doesn't actually add any value, says thank you and goes home, you should fire them. But that's a big thought. So I guess it sounds, for anyone outside the boardroom, that's like, well, of course. But inside the boardroom, that's big talk. So I think my big idea on all of that is we're living in a much more transparent world. We as board directors are used to living in a black box world where the doors close with a whoosh and no one knows what happens in there. And we don't live like that anymore. We will be held to account, personally account, for the decisions that we make in the boardroom. And we need to be able to make sure that every time we walk in the room, we ask ourselves, why are we here? And we remind ourselves, it's not about us. It's about who we represent and what we represent, and making sure that we're doing the thing that we should be doing in that room. So I leave you with that. And now I take my risk as I walk back. Here I go.
Thank you so much to all the panelists for your big ideas. And the way it's going to work this morning is we're going to have a discussion between the panelists, and then we'd like to open up to questions from the audience. So please do make sure you think of a question as the conversation is flowing. And I guess I just wanted to start by observing that we get a sense that there's an incredible amount of inertia within companies. They see this massive transformation happening, their business models are being disrupted, and yet they still seem to be on the verge of figuring out what steps to take, but they're not quite ready to jump. And I wonder if you could think about some practical ways that companies can actually start to change. What steps should they be taking? What steps should individuals be actively taking to start this process of transformation to this new age that you have been speaking about? Who would like to kick off?
I think
Holly.
the number one thing to me is to realize that some of these human issues, whether it's creating a culture that allows failure or dealing with the board problem or building skills, those are business problems that can be solved in a factual, data-based, rational way, just like a technology problem or a process problem. If you don't know how to do that internally, get help outside. There are people who know how to do this, but you have to conceive of it as something that is in fact designable, manageable, and buildable, not just something that we hope will be okay. Hope is not a strategy.
So I'd like to add that I think it is a partnership between the corporate world and then the employee base. So, for example, corporations have historically taken care of employees, and we know that efficiency and productivity is not going to allow that for the future. So the company needs to create the environment so that the employees can flourish and take charge of their careers. With that said, when I look at the statistics of how much time an employee spends on career development, an hour and a half a year, by the way, versus 2,700 hours of sleeping a year, and you think about you're working 8 hours a day and you're sleeping 8 hours a day, there's something off in that balance. So I think there has to be more focus by employees to think about their own personal journeys and how that they are going to really take control and initiate more rather than waiting back.
Ashwin, sorry, go
I
ahead.
think one specific thing that people can do in their organizations is to designate time. This might be once a quarter, once a month, once a year, to do some kind of a inclusive hackathon. Call it a Lollapalooza, call it what you like, but where people get together, in make-a-fair sort of fashion. You come in dressed in your jeans, and you spend the day trying to solve problems. You sit around tables and tackle some big problem, come up with a new idea. It might be a problem set by the company. It might be a problem that you as an employee has kind of been nagging at you all year, and now you get a couple of your colleagues to say, let's try to tackle this, see what happens. I've done this in my startups as well, and it's very productive, because people who work day and night at their jobs and love their companies, they're often bursting with ideas. I think we do try to surface the ideas, but let's also give them a chance to work on those ideas and try to make them real, try to get them to prototype, and we see really good things happening from that. Of course, Google is famous for doing this with their 20% time, but there's no reason that really all companies can be doing some version of this, not necessarily every week, but on a schedule that makes sense to you.
I think part of it as well, from a board perspective, is it is very, for board members, many of us sit on a number of boards, and there is such a thing as going overboard on boards and sitting on too many boards. But if you have the balance right, and you're sitting on the boards of companies that you really like, then actually you're interested in what they're doing and you want to know more. It is our obligation as board directors to have continuing education as well. And so having strategy days and also having regular inductions about what the company is doing and diving deep. There is this tension between hands-on and hands-in, because as board directors, we take a lot of decisions, but we can't execute those decisions. But we need to understand also, we need to be a lot more on receive than send. I mean, one of the things that I do is I love Twitter, and I am very active on Twitter, and the reason is because I hear it helps me to keep a hands-on view of what's going on in the world. And if I'm only reading just the papers that are sent to me, papers are are sort of massaged with, they're prepared very carefully, and they're massaged like Japanese cows, so that by the time they get to us, they're supposed to make it easy. It's true, isn't it? They're supposed to make it easy for us to say yes, but actually part of my responsibility as a director is to ask hard questions and to get not just the papers, but also have a Google Alerts on the company and understand what people are saying. By the way, my top tip for today is I've discovered Google Alerts not so good anymore. I use a service called Mention, which actually, have you used it?
No,
it's much better actually, and it gives you, so I sit on the board of a company called Atlantia, which is an Italian company, and so I have it so that Mention sends me anything in social media or in the press, both in Italian and Spanish and English and so on, so that I know what the company's doing. I hear things now before other board members about things that are coming up, and I sent a note actually to my investor relations guy there, say, I've heard this, I've read this story about a sale we're doing that I knew nothing about, and they were waiting to prepare the documents to tell the board members about it. But as board directors, we're supposed to be in there. But for a lot of board directors, even having a Google Alert is radical. So, but we need to. It's true. I mean, I know it sounds crazy, but it's absolutely true. And Twitter is like, that's like crazy talk, But actually, we need to be much more engaged, and we need to be teaching ourselves and making sure that we're raising our hands, the way that you're talking about, and educating ourselves. And we need to push ourselves a lot harder, and that means maybe having less boards investing more time.
I think let me just add, one big idea that is taking off with a lot of companies now is the focus on the lattice and the lateral moves as opposed to the ladder vertical moves, and rewarding employees for those who really say, I will make those stops around a company, because it doesn't always mean that you're going to get that big bump up in a title. But if you can reward and compensate employees for developing their own experience, which is really what's in demand now in the transdisciplinarity, is wide variety of experiences, then you would see more opportunities, and employees would be more interested in staying there and doing more for the firm. So that's something to really, it's very easy to implement, right? It's just rewarding this way as well as this way.
I think that's a really interesting point, and it seems to me that there, in the industrial age, we've built up these silos within companies, and people have felt that, they're great in finance, they're not really keen on the people in sales because they're a bit, too lacking in discipline. There seems to be almost a culture of not working across companies and not working with the people that are in a different space to you.
That's right.
And that's got to completely change, hasn't it? And without even people changing jobs, they have to start getting used to working with people across the disciplines, all the disciplines of the company.
Exactly, or developing the other areas. So if you're not strong in finance, but you're very strong in sales, is being able to say, let me go, build up that experience. Because let's face it, the reason I brought up build versus buy is executives go out and say, I want to buy that person who did all that work. And it gets very expensive, the acquisition cost of actually buying talent. So you can more efficiently look internally and have much better customer service and employee satisfaction by looking at what you can do inside.
Holly, how does a company set themselves up to facilitate that sort of collaboration?
One of the things, and I feel like I should be wearing my T-Rex costume here because this is kind of notes from a dinosaur, but when I go into organizations, that I am fascinated by is how poor people's communication skills are, and particularly listening. And as we virtualize, we're no longer sitting down next to people. We're having to communicate through Twitter, through collaboration platforms, through the telephone. I spend my whole day on teleconferences with people around the world. And yet, interpersonal communication skills is basically off the development agenda. It's been off the development agenda for probably 15 years. I don't know a single major client I'm working with that has that in a formidable position on the employee development agenda. And how can you communicate with people and collaborate, if you cannot come to commonality in language and concepts, if you cannot hear what the other person is saying and know to clarify that until you're in the same place. So I think one of the things that I would really encourage leaders to do is get that basic skill training back on the agenda. What I would encourage employees to do is think about those things, ask the questions, pay attention to the interpersonal communication that's going on. When you have 140 characters to send a key thought, you've got to be crystal clear.
I love it.
Crystal clear.
I really love it. I love that sort of, if you can't put it in 140 characters, then you don't really know what you're talking about. I don't want to hear from you. I can no longer write long, and I can't read very long either. No, it's good.
Ashwin, you're a specialist in artificial intelligence and technology being able to interpret our communication. Perhaps you could elaborate on how is technology aiding our communication? Can it aid our communication, or is it working against it?
So I think technology increases our reach. I don't know that it improves our communication. I'm completely in agreement with what you said. Communication requires face-to-face time. And I think one of the ways that we learn to communicate with other people is just by getting more practiced at it. I was speaking with several of the folks here in Lee's organization, and I said, so what do you do? What's your background? And they're all IT people. And you think, well, that's not surprising. She runs an IT organization, right? So we tend to hire people like ourselves in our organizations. If you come to my group, right, we're a computer science group. We do computer technology research. But I have on my staff a psychologist, a social scientist who couldn't write a line of code to save her life, ethnographers, designers. One of our best software architects was an English major. Right? In fact, when we hire, quite often I say, don't give me computer science degrees. Find someone else who knows and has learned my subject, but wasn't trained in it. Because by collecting people of different types in the same organization and then creating those communication opportunities, we learn how to talk with each other, we learn how to appreciate different points of view, and we start to broaden our own minds. I think it's really important that we mix up our organization. So yes, we should certainly look at training individual people with sort of broader skill sets and broader communication skills. I think one of the best ways to do it is really look at, again, what you call the human architecture. The organizational systems we create need to have a lot of diversity in them, because from that diversity comes this kind of training and learning of how you communicate with other people.
That's interesting, because at the same time, aren't we also being told that children should be learning to write code at school, and that software is sort of taking over companies? So
I think people should learn to write code.
Did you?
But I don't think they necessarily have to become software engineers. Right? There's a difference. I think we teach kids to write, and we teach kids to draw, and we teach kids to do math. Right? But they don't become mathematicians or artists necessarily. They have those skills. So computation is a kind of literacy we want our kids to have and be able to apply, but not necessarily to limit their thinking.
I think it's a really good point, actually, because when you think about also the changing nature of who's sitting around the boardroom table, you need people who speak the language that's being spoken out in the world now. So one of the interesting things that we see when search firms are going out and looking for new board members and so on is, when I talk to them, I say, I don't think anybody who is added to a board these days should not, everyone must, let's put it in a positive, anyone who sits around a board table these days must understand how to use Twitter and Facebook and social media. You don't need a social media expert, but you do need people who actually speak the language that people are speaking now. When BP had its oil spill, the people around that table were used to speaking, BP to Kremlin, BP to White House. They were used to a certain kind of communication and a certain kind of power structure. but the rest, and look, as board directors, we're fairly arrogant. So when we sit around the table, people come in and present to us and so on, and advise us. But unless you've got someone around the table during the actual discussion who actually understands the topic somewhat, it doesn't quite seep in the same way. So what ended up happening is they were completely flummoxed. They were completely caught unawares by an entire world of people who were having a conversation on Facebook and Twitter, and it actually had power to move things. And so we need people, when I talk about diversity, it's also diversity of skills and abilities and a common understanding. Again, you don't need a social media expert, who speaks the lingy of, sort of Twitter, but you do need people who understand that the way we communicate has changed. And everything else around, all the things that these people are talking about, we need to be able to integrate those conversations. And that's why also lifelong learning for board members and the willingness to take risks and actually try Twitter. So I was at a gathering of powerful board members recently. There were 50 of us in a room, and from all over the world. I should note, and Nora and I were talking about this yesterday, that 3 of us were women in that room. There was 1 person of color in that room, so a larger issue. But I sat next to somebody who runs a very large international retail outfit, and it was at dinner, and I thought, well, usually you don't talk about Twitter with board members. That seems ridiculous. And I said to him, hey, what do you guys, what do you think of Twitter? And he's like, something my grandchildren do. I said, just for fun, why don't we look up your company name on Twitter? I pull out my, my Galaxy, and I type in the company name, and up comes these results. He turned a special color of puce. And it's not, there was a whole conversation going on that he didn't know anything about, and that his people had not told him anything about, because they knew his reaction to Twitter was, that's something for grandkids. And so I said, hey, let's put your name in and see what comes up. And he thought, the way kids do that, like if you have 4-year-olds in your life at some point and they say, you can't see me, he thought that if he wasn't on there, that no one was talking about him, So we put in his name. I can't describe the color that he turned, because of course there was a whole conversation going on about him that he didn't know what was going on. And again, we don't exist in a world where if we cover our eyes, it's not happening. And so, we need to also make sure that we're skilling up and that we understand what's happening. And that's part of what needs to happen around the board table. And most of us come from a time when, and we will for the rest of our lives, the world is changing. It's our job to keep up with it. The world isn't not supposed to keep up with us. We need to understand, meet our customers and our clients and our partners where they are. And that's the challenge for the boardroom as well.
And that's interesting. At Boss Magazine, we recently did a study on how many bosses are using Twitter. And out of the top 100, we came up with 4 active CEOs on Twitter. And I think it was quite an extraordinary finding, because...
And usually they're not using it themselves. They have, their people do it,
That's right. Yeah. And, I mean, there is an argument that says if you're not some people say if you're not a customer-facing organization, if you're CEO of, BHP or Rio Tinto, then you're not dealing with retail customers, so you don't necessarily need it. But I guess that brings me to my next question, and after this, I'd like to open up the floor to questions. But there's a lot of talk about personal branding and how important that is for CEOs, for even, individuals, employees, executives. What should we be doing individually in terms of our brand, do you think?
Yeah, I'd like to address that. I had a unique opportunity at one of the firms that I worked with, Cisco Systems, where they wanted each employee to actually go through personal branding program. They felt that the brand should not be held at the CEO level or at the executive level, that each employee should have a very strong brand, and that could be positioned to the press, could be positioned as experts. And people really embrace that at the employee level. And what it means internally is that you become an expert. You become the go-to person. You become the go-to person for projects, for cross-functional teams, but also for the outside world. And I think that was one of the better things that Cisco did later in the journey of the company, to really be able to empower employees to feel like they had a voice to the public and that they were special. So I think personal branding, whether you're an entrepreneur or whether you work in a company is a very important aspect, and each individual, you can do that on your own. You don't have to wait for a company to really say, okay, we'll let you brand yourself, because you can brand yourself through projecting what your skills and expertise and your success is. So it's a great question. Thank you.
You know, what interests me about that is, and I'm very much in favor of it, but I think there's an unintended consequence sitting there that it takes tremendous managerial skill to manage. Because if I go back to your preceding question around how do you get collaboration, when I'm asked that by executives, one of the first things I always say is remove the barriers. Instead of investing in all kinds of technology and all kinds of fora and all kinds of reward system, remove the barriers. And what do I mean? In most organizations today, and by the way, from what I've seen, I think AMP has done an extraordinary job of overcoming a lot of these things. So this is not a reference to you. But what I see out there is organizations that still reward people for being individually smart, not collectively smart. And that, to me, is where the danger of the personal branding comes in. I'm all for it, but how do we align reward systems that take people who are personally branded and personally smart and allow them to collaborate and value that? We still tend to reward people for individual achievement, not collective achievement. In many tech companies, particularly in the Silicon Valley area, we reward people for ideation, not execution. So we may innovate, but then we take a very long time to get those things to market because it's not a popular thing to do. So I think you need to think about, when we're talking about all these wonderful, proactive, positive things like personal branding, look at what that's doing to your culture, how that plays into your culture, and how you're going to manage that with respect to the other agenda that you have.
I have a very uncomfortable relationship with the idea of personal branding because, and I think it's because although I am American by background, I actually have lived in the UK for 20 years. So I'm actually British now, and we're not big on sort of, it's uneasy making to put you're not supposed to put yourself out there in that sort of way. But saying that, I do think what's important is authenticity. So, especially when you are in a position that people look to you, when you sit on a board or when you're writing or talking, people look to you in ways that you're not completely conscious of to get signals about what you think and who you are. And from that perspective, it is really important. And and again, I love Twitter. I'm ranked as the 5th most influential business person on Twitter in the UK after Richard Branson and Alan Sugar. Sure, that's exactly where you want to be, but it's not something I'm consciously thinking, I got to get myself out there, I got to get myself out there. I just share what I find is interesting. I read an article, I think it's interesting, I share it. I have conversations with people, and I think the difficult thing is when you're in a position where you're doing confidential things, people worry about oversharing as a board member. I don't tweet the minutes. I follow the same rules when I'm on Twitter as I do in life. You don't write something or say something you wouldn't want on the front page of the New York Times or the Financial Times or whatever else. If you follow some simple logical things, then you're not going to be in danger. I don't say, oh, acquisition next week. But that's just dumb. I also don't do that at breakfast. So I think there's a way of being accessible and being authentic. Like, this is pretty much it. This is me all the time. Anybody who knows me, I usually actually have a slightly more potty mouth than this. But besides that, I have to admit it, I have to learn Italian for this board, and I've instructed my Italian tutor, do not teach me any Italian curse words because I will use them in inappropriate circumstances. But besides that, I think it is possible to get yourself out there and to speak about and write about and talk about. I write about things that are uncomfortable. And that make other people uncomfortable sometimes because they're inside issues that I write about sort of excessively. But I think that's part of the transparency of today. It is possible to show who you are without violating confidentialities and making other people uncomfortable. And so and also it makes you more accessible. I'm apparently one of the 6 most connected women in Britain, but my dirty secret is actually I never see people. Actually, I'm always on the road. People think they know me because they see what I write on Twitter, or they see my columns, or they see the TV show, but actually, ask anyone how often they see me, and when I'm in the UK, I'm at home with my kid. You know, I actually don't go out very much. So I think it also means that people feel like they know you without actually knowing you, if you see what I mean, and it gives you more me time, or more Maximilian time in my case. But I want to be with my family, but it allows that sort of space.
Thank you. Well, please do put up your hand if you'd like to ask a question. Yes, up the back. Go ahead.
I was interested in the comments around the tea person. You can buy them, and instead of where we buy them, they get made out of educational institutions. And it strikes me that educational institutions are more geared towards the industrial age or the manufacturing age. And are they training them? Are they building complete tea persons, building on the creativity side and the arts and the humanities? I just wanted to be interested in your thoughts on that, and are they coming out, senior graduates coming out of university?
And I'm just going to ask, summarise that question for people up the back. Are our universities really educating people to be these cross-disciplinary tea types of people? Is that the sort of the education that our universities are providing?
In terms of buying, what I see that's happening in my current research with recruiters and hiring managers is they're really looking for the middle tier person who's actually taken on themselves to go out and do the various stops, skill building and experience building at the management level to be able to come into a company and pick up an operation. So it's the person who's taken upon themselves to say, okay, the university, it's done. But I have gone out and continued my career journey by creating myself as a marketable product and someone who is very desirable for a lot of companies. So to your question, no, not all universities are doing it, but many are. There's a new focus at some universities, basically for survival, to be able to be more, have their students more employable upon graduation. And internships, quite frankly, is one method that universities are using to be able to incubate students earlier to learn how to work in companies. The other one is actually the boot camp. Some companies are actually pulling employees and students in to have rapid boot camp. Goldman Sachs is one that's actually doing that in addition to Facebook.
I am just one other thought on that. I chaired something called the Global Task Force on Building Women Leaders, and what we did was a survey. We wanted concrete things that sort of skills building and so on, and we went out and we spoke to women all over the world, women who were in successful positions, and prime ministers and chief executives and so on, to ask them what they felt was important for their career development and how we could apply it to other people. And there were several key things. One was mentoring, and different kinds of mentoring at different stages, and getting a broad level of skills at an early age, and then sort of it goes up to peer mentoring. So sitting with women at your level, once you're on a board, you talk to other women, and they push you, and you push them, and so on. The other was actually getting the right skills at the right time. We often, as companies, invest in things like negotiation or presentation, but once people reach middle management. But actually, those are skills that young people need as soon as they go into the workforce. And if the companies don't provide it, they need to find ways of providing for themselves. Because if you don't get things like negotiation and public speaking and fundamental skills, presentation, that sort of stuff at an early age, you won't make it to the place where you can do something else. So, and the other is travel. And the interesting that this is something I love about Australians. We were talking about it last night. You guys, you travel the world, and that is actually, people who have made it to successful points in their career have lived other places or visited other places, and it doesn't matter what sector you're in, or even if you're a local councillor, you still need to know what's happening around the world. And so that actually is really fundamental, and Australians are brilliant at that. And also bringing skills here. I mean, something like this, where you actually bring people from other parts of the world. And the only other thing that I see that could be better in some ways, is actually having those people from all over the world integrated throughout the company. So on board level on down, international people involved, even if your company is seemingly just domestic, you still need that international perspective to see what's happening and how that will play in the rest of the world. That's the only other piece I think is really important.
Thanks. Another question? Yes.
Can you talk a little bit about where youth fits into this conversation? I mean, the generation with the biggest stake in the future seems awfully absent from the conversation. And to the extent I understand millennials, they communicate and engage in very, very different ways than we're talking about here.
Yeah, so we just completed a research study that compared generation and gender views on leadership and the expectations. And we found that the millennial generation, Generation Y, was much more confident than previous generations, were much more interested in entering in leadership roles at a much younger age, and much less willing to wait, which is why, to some of the points that we've been discussing, how critical it is to be able to integrate the younger generation into more leadership opportunities much earlier in their careers. In terms of Generation X, quite interesting enough, they're sort of the sandwich generation because they've been patiently following the direction of the baby boomers and waiting for their next in line, but the baby boomers aren't ready to retire. And so the millennials are chomping at their heels, and the baby boomers are resisting. And so Generation X is actually the generation, by the way, in the 40s and 50s with the management skills experience that is passively waiting to be plucked out and look for opportunities. So it's a very good question, a very timely question. The other area that I think is important that we found in our research is that the millennial and Y generation grew up in an era where entrepreneurism is encouraged, and it's basically much easier to become an entrepreneur because it's not as capital intensive. And then you can thank the internet for those opportunities, and that's very inspiring because, quite frankly, at least in the United States, I see the need for more business creation, and millennials will probably be the generation that's really testing and trying a lot of these new business models. Fantastic question.
I think from a boardroom
I
perspective.
just wonder if, Ashwin, do you have a view on that question?
Yeah, so I think one of the things to add is that the newest generation now is starting to be called Generation C for connected. They're very communicative, they're very connected with each other, and they're very used to the idea of relying on groups of people, and groups of their friends, their peers, and even strangers to get things done. So back to some of the early conversation about teamwork, about communication skills. These kids have very good communication skills. They may communicate differently, but they're very good communicators. And we can, I think, learn a few things from that. And by absorbing them into our company cultures, I think we can create these kind of communicative and interdependent, interreliant networks within our companies. They're not as kind of individualistic as we tended to be growing up through our education system.
I think from a boardroom perspective, part of that is, that we need to skill up better so that we understand how they're communicating. So that's this point about Twitter and Facebook and whatever comes next, to be able to, because they're big consumers and we need to understand what they're talking about. One of the problems is in Australia, you do what we do in the UK, you have term limits on boards. So it's not predetermined because of retirement age. In the US, well, you basically, they keep raising the retirement age for board members. And basically you can't get rid of a board member unless they go out toes first, like the Pope. Well, not anymore. The Pope has completely changed that dynamic. But it is an interesting question because they don't put, a lot of times they don't put younger people on boards in the US because conceivably you could stay on a board for 30 or 40 years, and people do, by the way, as independent board directors on Coke and Nike and a number of companies have board directors who have been on their boards 30 and 40 years, which is, you wouldn't do anything that long besides be a parent and be married maybe, and so be alive. And so what's interesting about the millennials is they have more in common to a certain extent with people from other cultures of their age than they do with people of other generations in their own countries. So my son relates very easily to his friends in Australia or his friends in Japan, and they're having the same experience culturally what they eat, what they watch, what they see, because of the global nature of the way things are working now, then he might with me, and definitely with his grandmother in Germany, all they pretty much have in common is a language that they can speak together. But what they're talking about, she has no idea what the heck he's talking about most of the time, his cultural references and so on. But he can have an easy conversation with people from around the world, which we couldn't have, and certainly the generation above me, don't have as much in common with other countries.
Holly, sorry, almost lost it. Do you have a view on the youth and how they
what comes
operating?
up for me listening to that, and I agree with you completely. It's interesting. I didn't think about it, but that voice is absent here. That voice is absent, and I think that's an interesting.
We're young at heart.
We're young at heart. When I look at kind of the organizational challenges that I'm helping people with, you used the word that they're very impatient. They are very impatient. They have different definitions of loyalty, of expectations. And one of the things that I see organizations struggling with is once we identify this talent, how do we hang on to it?
Yeah.
Because it's out the door in a year or 2 years at most, unless we are giving it sufficient challenge internally. And what challenges that generation may be fundamentally different than what challenges someone of my age group. And I think that's indeed one of the big questions that large organizations have to wrestle with. Why do I even want to be part of a large organization when I can go out and innovate and be entrepreneurial on my own?
But the only thing that I find, I don't know about you, but I find uncomfortable is when I talk to, I teach, I'm a professor. I'm a sort of fake professor, to be honest, at IE Business School. I like the title, though. In Germany, where people like it when you're called a professor. But when I have people in my classroom and they want to know, how they can be me. So you were once me. How can I be you? To be honest, I work hard. I work all the time. I'm a hard worker, and I say to them, it's not like you can just snap your fingers and it happens. And there is a message that gets lost, and I don't mean to sound like a fuddy-duddy, but there is something that gets lost, which is this sort of, we want fame, we want power, we want to be on a board. I had a 20-year-old say to me, how can I join a board? And I said, what do you know how to do? What are you good at? I mean, I don't, but she couldn't tell me, but she just thought it was a sort of matter of like, well, boards need more women, and they need people like me, and what is a person like you? We still require skills and abilities. You still need to skill up. You need to do the hard work and invest to get that. And that somehow, and I sound a little bit old, but and for boards, I'm very young, so it's a kind of weird world to be in. But
Lucy, maybe, we've got some boards that are advisory boards. For example, some companies are creating Asian advisory boards.
Yes.
So maybe we need youth advisory boards as well, who don't have any fiduciary responsibilities.
Right.
I wonder if there's any other questions.
In Australia, there seems to be a lot of talk about a skills shortage, especially in the ICT sector, and as organisations go through a big period of change and they adopt new technologies, like for example in big data analytics, they might struggle to find the resources or the skills to do that kind of work. What would your advice be, or what would you say to organisations who are facing this kind of challenge?
My suggestion is we have to make it exciting and sexy, People want to be able to role model after people who have very glamorous and exciting lives, and historically, the picture of IT and technology has been painted as being rather dismal and not very exciting. We worked with a woman who actually, her daughter was a chemist and biology genius, and then she started to fear moving into that discipline in college. And we swiftly found role models of glamorous women who were biologists and chemists to be able to show her that you still have an incredible social life and you can make money and be glamorous while in technology. But there is this perception of being limited. I think what a lot of companies are starting to do is really deep dive into the colleges and universities and the high schools to see if they can start to create programs where you can start to shadow and see the opportunities. And I'm sure you probably have some experience at Georgia Tech.
Yeah, we also need to have innovation in the universities. So before Park, I was a professor at Georgia Tech in computer science. And as in most institutes of technology, we had very few women and minority students. And in computer science, there were even fewer compared to some of the other disciplines. We introduced a new curriculum which is called computational media, It is a computer science degree, but it's done a little bit differently. We have about 35 to 40% women. We have students who take those introductory courses and say, you know, I didn't know that was computer science.
Yeah.
I thought computer science was about sort of late night hacking behind a terminal with a bunch of jocks in a room.
Yeah.
So you make it interesting, right? And it goes back to the earlier comment about computer literacy. Computer science and ICT is not programming. It's not about programming and software. It's a whole new way of thinking. And if we can create programs in companies for training, as well as in universities and even down to schools, that can help kids understand what the new computer science is, I think we'll attract people automatically.